Today we read from the book of Genesis, chapter 32, verses 22 to 32. That night Jacob got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 maidservants, and his 11 sons, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. After he had sent them across the stream, he sent over all his possessions. So Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. Then the man said, "Let me go, for it is daybreak." But Jacob replied, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." The man asked him, "What is your name?" "Jacob," he answered. The man said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with men and have overcome." Jacob said, "Please tell me your name." But he replied, "Why do you ask my name?" Then he touched him there. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "It is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared." The sun rose above him as he passed Peniel, and he was limping because of his hip. Therefore, to this day, the Israelites do not eat the tendon attached to the socket of the hip, because the socket of Jacob's hip was touched near the tendon. This is the reading of the word.
Thanks be to God.
Ooh, wow. Let me tell y'all, high schoolers don't say that any more enthusiastically than you do. Wrestling with God. I have always loved this particular story in Genesis because it sets a precedent that it's okay. We were talking in Bible study this morning that I think that this is one of the most unsung habits of faith. We talk about having faith in God, right? We talk about having hope, about being Christ-like. You know, Christ did this, right? Maybe not on the ground wrestling. I'm going to be brutally honest, getting up and down from the kids was bad enough. I don't think I can do brutally on the ground wrestling with God right now. And yet, I think the most beautiful part of this story is that Jacob might be the first one who we hear about it explicitly. But he's not the only one that wrestled with God. We move on through the book of Genesis and we hear Joseph's story. We like that story, right? Joseph and his coat of many colors. And he cries out to God, wondering, "Wait a second, Lord, you've forsaken me here in Egypt. You sold me away." Moses ran to the desert for 40 years. Before God said, "Hey, I'm going to send you a burning bush to say, come back. Let's make it easier." No, it wasn't 40 years. It was a length of time. Actually, they don't say it specifically, but 40 is like a very biblical number if you weren't aware. Generally, scholars say he was probably in the desert 40 years, growing into adulthood before God sent him to free the Egyptians, and then they wandered in the wilderness again for 40 years. Just to clarify where that comes from. Moses, though, ooh. And what about David? We like David. Facing down giants. We don't like David so much when he's sending one of his best army generals to war so that he could then take his wife. You don't think David wrestled with God? And then we got Job. I love that story. We've got Ruth. We love, where you go, I will go. We don't think about what that means. We've got Mary and Joseph. And oh man, do you not think that they wrestled with the fact that they were going to be the Messiah's parents? We've got Peter, who denied his Savior. We've got Paul, who said, I'm going to crucify every Christian known to man, and then suddenly I'm blinded on the road. And now I've got to change not only myself, but everyone's understanding of what I believed. Are you for real, God? Is this really what you want me to do? Wrestling with God is in and throughout every single story of faith that we hear in our scriptures. And perhaps we don't always liken it to wrestling. I think that we have these images. We either have an image of the down on the mat wrestling, which is real wrestling, or we have WWE wrestling where they're in big fancy lights and really weird costumes. That's not wrestling, just to let you know. Don't quote me on that. I don't want to get like anyone coming back. No. But wrestling with God, going head to head and saying, God, I got questions. I have questions about this life that I'm living. I don't know if I'm headed one way or the next. There's not just two roads diverged in a yellow wood. There are 7 paths, God. I don't know which one to take. I got a really unfun diagnosis, Lord. Why me? Why? Isn't that at the heart of every question? That lovely 3-letter word that we hate to hear when our kids ask it 800 times for the understanding of every single thing that is coming and going. Why? Why? It's adorable in some ways when they're wanting to understand. It is not as much fun when it is coming from our own lips. Why? There are a lot of stories of the assurance of faith after this point. And yet we don't often delve into what wrestling with God looks like. We have an expectation that it might be, a little time of an unsung time of faith where we're not quite certain, but God pulled us through, and here we go, and we are ready and strong, and we believe in you, Lord. We liken it to this single night, right? I wrestled with God one night, came out the other side, and I'm good. Are we really? You all are laughing at me because you know it's not that simple. Did you know that the word Israel, a word that describes an entire population of of people in Hebrew means struggles with God. Faith is constantly a struggle between what we want to believe and what we actually believe. You see the distinction there, I'm hoping. It's a struggle between what we want to believe, what we hope to believe, what we are being told over and over again we ought to believe, and what we actually do. I can tell myself I am gorgeous every single day of my life. I can hear my sweet, sweet, wonderful, hello, right? I can hear my sweet and wonderful spouse say the same thing. If I don't believe it, doesn't matter. If I, at the heart of it, do not believe, then the assurances that every other person throws at me may or may not matter. They might give me cause to think. Might give me more questions. But until I go head to head with God, until I go, Lord, why? What? How? When? Oh man, that's another one of those questions, right? It's not always why. Sometimes why is so closely followed by when. God, I've been praying for this for an incredibly long time, Lord. When? When? You see, we as people of faith will constantly be wrestling with God at different points in our lives. And then we'll come from that, hopefully, changed. Because Jacob was changed. Not only was he no longer to be called Jacob, he would be called Israel. And become the father of a people by the same name. But he also walked away from that wrestling match limping, having to regain strength in his limbs. He wasn't only mentally and emotionally changed, he was physically changed. And I think that we forget about that. When we come out of that wrestling match with God, we are changed irrevocably. We will never be the person that we were before. Sometimes that's a fantastic and wonderful thing. Sometimes that leads us to another wrestling match. Sometimes we come away from this filled with peace and assurance, because right after this moment is when Jacob looks up and he sees his brother Esau, from whom he had not seen and whom he had been estranged from for years. And they find forgiveness and compassion with one another. That's not always going to happen, right? Sometimes it takes another wrestling match. And not just us. You see, one of the beautiful things that we were talking about in Bible study, of course, was that wrestling with God is not always just a singular endeavor either. You're not always alone. I mean, look around you. You're not alone. Unless you're a single person, no, I mean like in your pew by yourself. Some of you all like to sit by yourselves on purpose. People smell, right? We're not alone. See, wrestling with God is sometimes something that, yes, we must do in the dead of night when we are alone by ourselves, able to ask the hardest questions, able to cry out. And then other times, wrestling with God is best done with another. Because the honest truth is that we are all at some point wrestling. We're all at some point wrestling. And we're there to help one another, to support one another, to love one another through it. And to be assured of God's presence with us through it all. Because that's the biggest takeaway perhaps from this, is that God is big enough to handle it. We talk a lot, or we hear a lot, perhaps it's not talk so much, we hear a lot about how we are supposed to act, be, as Christians, as people of faith. And again, this is something we don't talk about enough. We don't talk about what it takes to get from point A in our faith to point B. We don't talk enough about the struggle, the questions, the ups and the downs, the hills and the valleys, the different people that perhaps influenced us, the different points in our lives, the tug towards and the tug away. My hope and my prayer for us all is that we take this testimony of faith, for it is a testimony. It's a testimony to the assurance that even in wrestling with God, God is still with us, is present with us, and our faith can be both challenged and made stronger. We ourselves are evidence of that testimony. For how many of us in this room have struggled? You don't have to raise your hands because I know y'all are going to, right? Yes. Had questions. Been uncertain.